Sundown Towns, presented by Group 11. Sundown towns are all-white communities, neighborhoods, and counties that exclude blacks and other minorities through the use of discriminatory laws, harassment, and threats or use of violence. The name derives from the posted and verbal warnings issued to blacks that although they might be allowed to work or travel in a community during the daytime, they must leave by sundown. Sundown towns began to appear after the Civil War. They were also referred to as gray towns. There were 10,000 sundown towns between 1890 and 1960, mostly located in the West and the Midwest. The towns peaked in the 1970s and their numbers began to decline. However, there are still sundown towns in existence today. The towns began to develop more rapidly as African Americans began leaving the South to escape racism and poverty during the Great Migration. Predominantly white communities actively discouraged them from moving in, though typically referred to in the terms of the exclusion of blacks. Other groups such as Jews, Native Americans, Chinese, Japanese, and other minorities were targeted as well. In some communities, black populations were forcibly removed or run out of town. They were accused of crimes they did not commit and lynched, convincing others in the community to leave out of fear that they could be the next victims. Many were ousted by unions who united and refused to grant them employment. Their homes were burnt down and mobs tied them to trees, whipping them. These acts were referred to as racial cleansing. Sundown towns were enforced through the imposition of Jim Crow laws and other segregation practices. The Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that were used to legalize segregation. They existed for approximately 100 years from the post-Civil War era until 1968. They were used to undermine and belittle African Americans by denying them the right to vote, pursue further education, hold jobs, and other opportunities. Those who tried to rebel or defy the Jim Crow laws could face possible fines, arrest, jail sentences, violence, and even death. The formation of the Jim Crow laws began when the 13th Amendment, which had abolished slavery, was ratified in 1865. The Black Codes, also known as Black Laws, were strict, discriminatory laws that were passed after the Civil War. These laws were used to govern African Americans. They decided what type of work and how much compensation those who were formerly enslaved could receive. It was popularized in the South and used as a legal way to force black people into a slavery contract, once again controlling where they lived, where they could travel, and even took children away for other labor purposes. The Black Codes are different from the Jim Crow laws. They came after the abolition of slavery and the South's defeat in the Civil War. The Black Codes were formed during the Reconstruction era. The Jim Crow laws began towards the end of the 19th century, after the Reconstruction era. There were also sundown laws, which stated that blacks could not live in or travel through certain towns after dark. In Oregon, even though they had banned slavery in 1844, had banned blacks from the territory. Those who refused to leave could expect to receive regular lashings. This was possible under a law known as the Peter Burnett Lash Law, named after Provisional Supreme Court Judge Peter Burnett. No one was ever lashed because it was quickly amended to replace lashing with forced labor. This law did not last long and got repealed the following year after a change in the makeup of legislature. Another case like this happened in Louisville, Kentucky, where the mayor proposed a law in 1911 that would restrict black people from owning property in certain parts of the city. This ordinance reached public attention when it was challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court case Buchanan v. Warley in 1917. Eventually, the court decided that the laws passed in Louisville were unconstitutional and set the precedent that similar laws cannot exist or be passed in the future. This still did not stop communities from developing into sundown towns. The Green Book and Route 66. As automobiles were becoming more common among working Americans and more people had leisure time, car travel became a very popular way to spend time with family, friends, and to see new places. Due to sundown towns not welcoming people of color and many businesses across the country not allowing them in, casual travel and road trips were not nearly as accessible to Black Americans as it was for everyone else. In 1936, Victor Hugo Green created the Negro Motorist Green Book to help Black people who wanted to travel but didn't quite know which areas would welcome them, or which restaurants, hotels, or bars they were allowed in. It was based on a similar publication for Jewish people that was published in Jewish newspapers in America. The first edition in 1936 was focused on the New York metropolitan area because Green was familiar with that area as a mailman. By the following year, the Negro Motorist Green Book was shifting to provide nationwide help. Green used his connection as mail carriers across the country to provide advice on places for Black people to stay or experience where they are welcome. As the Green Book grew in popularity, it started to even include home addresses of people who would not mind a Black person spending the night in their home. The helpfulness and accessibility of the Green Book made it possible for Black people to easily traverse a country full of sundown towns and segregated areas. Many other similar books followed soon after the creation of the Green Book, though none matched the popularity, accuracy, or symbolic status that the Green Book held. Many people referred to it as the Bible of Black travel. Victor Hugo Green's dream was for there to one day be a world where his book was not necessary. The Green Book received new editions until 1967, 3 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when the publishers decided it was no longer needed. Within the last 15 years, about half of the towns in the South who excluded African Americans have stopped doing so. With the data that was collected, it is difficult to get an accurate visual of exactly how many sundown towns still exist today. The history of sundown towns has been largely forgotten or overlooked. Many towns have burned their signs, and for many there is no official record that they ever existed at all. People continue to erase the dirty parts of our history that we don't want to remember.